Welcome to today's webinar about Small Charities Challenge Fund. Today's webinar is being hosted by Scotland's International Development Alliance. For those of you who don't know us, we are a membership organisation and we work with Scotland-based organisations who are undertaking work in international development and humanitarian affairs. We've got over 150 members. These range from NGOs, universities, social enterprise and consultancies and businesses in the sector. My name is Laura. I'm the Effectiveness and Learning Advisor at the Alliance, and I'm going to be your digital facilitator for today. We have had 63% of you vote in this poll so far, and we have the top answer so far is help supporting you develop your application is what most people would like to see to improve their confidence. Today we've got an hour and a half. I'm going to hand over it to Laura in just a minute to start the presentation, and then we have about half an hour for question and answer at the end. We're going to take questions at the end, but if you have a question as we go, please can you type it into the chat box and we will write that down and answer it. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, we are going to follow up by email afterwards. And please note, we can't answer any questions on specific applications, and please note that it is a public forum, so please don't include any confidential information in your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Laura, who's going to lead you through the presentation. If you do have any questions, please pop those in the chat box and we will get back to you shortly. Thank you, Laura.
So without further ado, so I'm Laura and I'm the grants manager at Mannion Daniels, and I specifically work on DFID's UK Direct Fund. So in terms of what I'm going to run through today, I'm going to obviously focus on the Small Charities Challenge Fund, but I will talk a bit more about UK Direct more broadly. I'll talk a bit about the eligibility criteria for the Small Charities Challenge Fund, the application and review process, as well as give guidance on aspects of the application process, and also share with you some tips we've received from previous applicants. And I have a couple of examples of previous applicants that have been both successful and unsuccessful to SCCF. So I'll chat through a bit about the areas where reviewers noted potentially weaknesses in their application or strengths in their application. And I'm really pleased to say that we have got an actual an example of a Scottish-based organisation who was successful in the second round of SCCF. So to begin with, I'll give you a bit of background about UK Direct. As mentioned, I work for Mannion Daniels and we are the fund manager for UK Direct. And what this essentially means is that we are contracted by DFID to deliver UK Direct. We're the lead partner for UK Direct. However, we work in a consortium with other organisations. So we have Oxford Policy Management, we have WEDEC, who are a water and sanitation organisation based out of Loughborough University. We have the Education Development Trust, or EDT, and we also have the Royal Tropical Institute, who are also known as KIT, and they're actually based over in the Netherlands. So across the consortium partners, we kind of have specialise in different areas of development, and between us, we support DFID to run UK Direct. I should probably say, as Laura mentioned, that I will be taking questions at the end just because I think it's a little bit easier in a webinar format. So moving on, hopefully you've all been to and familiarised yourself with the UK Direct website, but this picture here is our landing page, so you may have already seen it. It really does contain a wealth of information covering the funding rounds. It details the eligibility criteria for all our different funding rounds. It includes frequently asked questions and guidance documents. And I really would recommend it as your first point of call after this webinar if you do decide that you want to apply for an SCCF grant. It's also where you'll actually need to go to start your application form. So I can't actually go, oh yeah, so here where my cursor's moving, the apply now button, that will take you to our Smile portal, which is where you'll go to complete your application form. So in terms of UKA Direct broadly, UKA Direct has been running since 2010. It was previously known as the Global Poverty Action Fund. It's essentially the UK government's funding mechanism to support small and medium-sized civil society organisations to achieve the global goals. It's multi-sectoral in nature and has been steadily growing for the past few years, and we now have 5 grant types. So we've got our UK direct grant types, and there are 2 different grants within that. So we've got our community partnership grants, which are for organisations with an income of less than £1 million, and we've got our UK direct impact grants for organisations with less than £10 million. And actually, our 4th UK direct funding round will be opening for applications on the 4th of March. So sometimes we do get SCCF applicants applying for community partnership grants. So if you are interested in applying for that as well, then do take a look at the UK direct area of the website. We also have 2 grant types under our Joe Cox Memorial Grants. So those grants were set up. They're a one-off funding round that was set up last year in memory of MP Joe Cox, and they have 2 different distinct themes attached to them. So theme 1 supports civil society to take an integrated approach to gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and theme 2 is about supporting providing support to strengthen civil society's capacity for early prediction of identity-based violence. And again, they are for strengthening grants is for organisations with an income of less than £500,000, and network grants are for organisations with an income of less than £10 million. So finally, we have our Small Charities Challenge Fund, otherwise sometimes known as SCCF. And that's for small organisations like yourselves with an income of less than £250,000. So in terms of the Small Charities Challenge Fund, it was set up to target small British grassroots organisations with an income of, with an average income of less than £250,000. Again, it's multi-sectoral in nature and is designed to reflect DFID's priorities, and I'll come on to those in a little bit. These grants are for up to £50,000 for projects lasting up to 2 years. In previous rounds, we have had ineligible projects apply because their proposals were for more than £50,000 or the project duration was for longer than 2 years. And of course, these projects can apply for our community partnership grants, but if you do apply for, if you do put in an application for more than £50,000, you'll automatically become ineligible. So I really would stress to check the eligibility criteria and make sure your application meets that before you submit it. So unlike other UK direct funding rounds, SCCF is an open round, which means applications will be reviewed every 6 months. We've reviewed 3 sets of applications already, and the 4th and currently the final SCCF funding round, the cut-off date for applications is Thursday the 28th of March 2019. So if you are, in the past we've had some applicants who have, because it has been this rolling application process, some applicants haven't felt in a position to apply, so they've waited until the next funding round. However, this is the final confirmed one, so we would strongly recommend that you go ahead and put an application form in for this final round if you do want to be considered, as we can't necessarily guarantee that there will be one going forward. So I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later when I cover the kind of financial and due diligence process. But following feedback from previous rounds, SCCF is now in a position to support grant holders to receive a limited payment in advance, which essentially means that successful applicants can receive an initial payment covering a proportion of your spend, your forecasted spend, but I will come onto that in a bit more detail later on. And this means that financial reports and claims will be made every 3 months, along with standard reporting on performance. Like I say, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail. As with all UK direct funding rounds, a key consideration for applicants should be to think about how your project will respond to one or more of DFID's strategic objectives. So these are strengthening global peace, security and governance, strengthening resilience and response to crisis, promoting global prosperity, tackling extreme poverty and helping the world's most vulnerable. And do take time to read DFID's strategic objectives and the departmental plan and consider how your project will respond to one or more of these. Some applicants also try and find out a bit more about what DFID country offices are doing in the countries that they're working in, and if you can find out that information, it's always good to include that in your application to show that you've really thought about how your application fits into DFID's priorities. So in terms of how you apply, as I mentioned, applications have to be submitted online. We won't accept applications in any other format than via our online portal of Smile. And to do this, you'll need to go to our website. As I showed you, via the landing page, click that red Apply Now button, and this takes you through to our online application portal. Each page will then talk you through what is expected at that stage. Reviews of this 4th funding round will take place shortly after the deadline on the 28th of March. The allocation for SCCF in its entirety is £4 million over the 2-year period it was initially set out, and this essentially translates as around £1 million per window. After applicants are notified that they've been successful, a full financial management assessment takes place from our fiduciary risk team, and due diligence is carried out to ensure that applicants really are eligible. And again, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later on. In terms of how applications are reviewed, we review them using a panel of experts from across the consortium of partners, and applications are allocated to reviewers based on their thematic area and of expertise and their country experience. So if, for example, you apply and your project is an education project based in Uganda, we would tend to allocate those projects to the Education Development Trust, one of our consortium partners, and they would allocate it to one of their reviewers with experience in Uganda. So we really do match up applications to reviewers who will know about that project and whether it's feasible, etc. All reviewers have significant experience working with DFID, supporting projects and assessing proposals, and we give them extensive training, guidance on how to conduct the reviews before they do it, and also the scoring criteria, so that we can ensure a consistent approach across all the applications. To ensure a fair assessment, we also quality assure the reviews that take place and the scoring. So for example, for every application now, we have a reviewer who just quality assures that the review that's taken place, to ensure that the score given is fair. Once reviews have taken place, scores and feedback for each application are then shared with DFID to moderate the reviews. and to look at the list of successful applicants that are coming out of the review process. And every applicant, whether they've been successful or unsuccessful, will receive detailed feedback about their proposal, and that will likely be in an overall strengths and weaknesses paragraph, which outlines it provides constructive feedback and outlines exactly the areas that perhaps you have fallen down in, or the areas that you were strong in. And this is with the aim of supporting applicants to improve their project along with their grant writing. And that's something that DFID are very much committed to doing. So we're often asked to demonstrate the types of projects that we do support. So on this slide, there are some examples, but you can also go onto our website for further details of the projects. And actually all the SCCF grant holders who have signed their contract and their projects are active should be listed on our website, so that you can get a feel for the types of projects that are currently being supported. And then we also have more detailed case studies. But for example, at the moment we have projects supporting rehabilitation of amputees through outreach and provision of prosthetics. We have projects on menstrual hygiene. We have livelihoods projects, so there's a specific one on beekeeping. We have a whole range of projects that SCCF is currently supporting. In terms of the projects we don't support, it is covered in the financial guidance section, so please do go on the website and really do look at which projects we won't support, because we wouldn't want to see you complete a whole application only for it to be ineligible. But we simply can't support projects that focus on infrastructure, buildings, or where it's a vehicle, it's solely focused on a vehicle. That's the majority of the budget. Because what we are really looking for is projects which can clearly show a developmental outcome. And by development outcome, we mean a specific change for your beneficiaries. For example, improve learning for children in a primary school, increase literacy rates as a result of a direct result of your project, and not simply a new classroom block. Orphanages or children's home also won't be supported. So DFID takes the approach of deinstitutionalisation, where they support projects which look to remove children from institutionalised care and support them to reunite them with their families, or to be placed in a caring, loving environment to nurture their needs. So DFID won't support those. So I would really recommend obviously not then applying for projects of those nature. In terms of designing your project, we do have a wealth of guidance documents on our website to support you, and there are some links embedded into this PowerPoint as well, which I've shared with Laura and she can share onwards. And hopefully this will help you in your application process. But so in terms of some tips, do consider how your project is contributing to UKAID Direct and DFID's objectives, as I've already mentioned. More than anything, keep your design simple. Sometimes less really is more, and we're looking for you to clearly articulate your project and clearly articulate what it is you're trying to do. Make sure your numbers align between your budget and your application form. This is something that we often see applicants fall down on, where their budget lists one amount that they're applying for, and in the narrative of their application they state another amount that they're applying for. Make sure your figures make sense. Again, ensure your budget is realistic. Look at what you're proposing to achieve in your first year or your first 6 months, and really drill down into these numbers and ask whether you can actually deliver, say, that many workshops in 6 months, or you can train that many people in 3 months, or should we be more realistic and spread that over a year? So the reviewers will be looking at whether they feel your project is realistic based on what you are saying. And you'll also be asked to fill out a results framework. And whilst the template is for 1 year, if your project is for more than 1 year, we do want you to fill it out for both of those years. So that's just something to keep in mind. So here are some top tips again for formatting and framing your application. On the right, you'll also see an example from Carers Worldwide, who are successful applicant, and do go on to that link that is embedded into the presentation, because we've actually now got Carers Worldwide application, and we've pulled out some of the questions and the answers that they gave, and basically outlined the positives of their application. So it is really helpful. But basically, as you can see, it's a very succinct, clear summary written by Carers Worldwide. You can clearly see what they are trying to do, who will be involved, and the specific area where the project will be carried out. You can find more of their, you do go on and look and have a look at their application, but sometimes when we ask that, then there's an initial question about to summarize your project, and applicants provide well, they basically max out the word limit and provide too much detail, and actually they're not very, it's not very clear what they're trying to achieve. In terms of the other tips in here, so don't feel like you have to max out the word count. Don't use jargon. Don't overuse acronyms. It can actually become quite difficult for a reviewer to review an application if you're continuously using, if there are multiple acronyms in the answer. This is just a tip. In general, it's very hard to read all applications in all capitals. We do often get that. Do use plain English, and write it from the point of view as if you're explaining your project to development experts, the UK public, your local beneficiaries, politicians, business leaders. I think one of the biggest things that I see when I see feedback given from reviewers is that it's very clear that applicants understand their project through and through, but they are making sometimes assumptions that that person reviewing understands their project and understands all elements of it, and you know, they don't necessarily clearly outline the backstory or the experience that they have. So do make sure that you are not making those types of assumptions. So think about the vision for your project. Don't just write something very generic like the example there. It's far too vague. Here's a very good example of one. It's from a project in Nepal, and we can clearly see that by July 2020, the number of plastic water bottles being recycled in Nepal will have increased significantly, and that the applicant, that the vision is that the number of water bottles being dumped in 4 landfill sites will have reduced to about half the current figures. So it's a lot clearer than that first example. These are very specific vision statements which give the reviewer a clear idea of the project. They clearly outline why your project is needed, and do use relevant statistics specific to your region and district, rather than just quoting national ones if possible. Again, sometimes applicants who are delivering a project, say in Kenya, will use national statistics, whereas they're working in a specific district, and they don't really paint the picture of why that project is needed in that specific district. And we want to understand what the problem is. Yeah, we want to understand what the problem is in your specific area. You don't necessarily need to provide the reference, but do put the source in brackets if possible and the year of the publication so we can see how relevant or up to date it is. So in terms of your project design, consider the following. So what is the change you want to happen by the end of the project? Do demonstrate a clear understanding of the local context and show that you've taken meaningful consultation with beneficiary groups and coordinated with key stakeholders, including with local government departments and other organisations. So here we want to know that you aren't, for example, duplicating other projects being undertaken by potentially by organisations who are working in the area, or that you have consulted with the local government. So again, you're not duplicating work that they're doing, and also that you're looking towards the future. So beyond the 2 years of your project, are you working with the local government to try and potentially mainstream your project into the services that they already provide? And it's also about showing you've met with your beneficiary groups and discussed their needs, and it's about showing how this is reflected in your approach. So did you meet with your beneficiaries going and you know there was the assumption that their needs were X, but actually they told you they were the Y, and you have amended your project design accordingly. The best applications are clear why they have selected a particular group, and again, do keep in mind DFID's priorities of reaching the most marginalised and vulnerable groups, and be clear about how you identified they were vulnerable and particularly marginalised. Applications often fall down by not always providing a clear link between the need and the intervention. And here it's about showing how appropriate the intervention is and how this will address the need and affect the change. During the last funding round, or the last few funding rounds, the results framework have on the whole been quite strong. There is lots of guidance on how to complete the results framework template on our website, and also a bit of background about what a results framework is and what we're looking for. But really it's about thinking about what a successful outcome of the project looks like. What do you want to see change by the end of the project? How will you monitor those results to show whether you've been successful? And this can often be something that is quite overlooked until project implementation, but it should be being thought about from the beginning and therefore should be reflected in your application. Think about how you will collect the data. Will it be physically? Will it be digitally? And it's really important to think about whether and or how the project will continue beyond UKA direct funding. This is something that DFID are very clear about, that they want projects that they want to see how projects are sustainable, and that the work that you're doing is sustainable and that you're considering that from the start. So do address that in your application form clearly. So for example, are you building capacity so that the project can become self-sustaining over the long term? This slide provides a breakdown of what the results framework should essentially look like, but as I said, there is a template for you to fill in. In terms of value for money, you really need to consider the following. So you need to consider economy, effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. So make sure you're taking a holistic approach rather than focusing on how your project fits into each of these areas. Economy analyzes unit costs and inputs, so consider whether you are getting the best quality of inputs at the best price. How will you measure this and how often? Effectiveness, are you as effective? Are you being as effective, or do you think you're being as effective in achieving your targets? In terms of efficiency, this measures whether you are delivering your intervention in the most effective way. If services or training, if you're delivering services or training, are you reaching the maximum number of people at the minimum cost, for example? In terms of equity, are you reaching the most vulnerable and those with the greatest needs? How did you target them? And are they really the most vulnerable? And obviously you need to be considering whether you can produce economies of scale by working in partnership. Have you considered this? Can you say that, can you explain how you've considered this? But crucially, you need to be showing what this grant will enable you to do that you wouldn't already be able to do. In terms of risks, we often see and hear that organisations get quite nervous that if they are very honest about potential risks, or they outline all the possible risks, that they will essentially get penalised and perhaps we won't want to support their project. But it really is actually the opposite. Projects which consider and mitigate against all risks are stronger projects, and essentially it minimises the overall risk to that project, and this is something that is obviously very important to DFID. So you need to be thinking about the risks the project faces. That could be security risks, it could be financial, it could be environmental, it could be political. Do be realistic. When you identify a risk, you need to put down a mitigation strategy for that risk. What would you do if that risk occurs, and how would you adapt the project to ensure that it remains on track? So in terms of, here's an overview of rough timings. So as I mentioned, the application window is, and just to note here, these are anticipated timings. The only one that is set in stone is the first one, which is the application window, because we do know that it's going to be open for 6 months, but everything else is anticipated, and sometimes timings do move, sometimes they're shorter, sometimes they're longer, but I think that's important to outline. So yeah, we've got the application windows open for the for that 26 weeks. Once applications come in, they are then reviewed, so we send them out to our consortium of partners, they're reviewed over a period of time, and then we allow for quality assurance. We then moderate them with DFID, and that process can take up to 10 weeks. We then send a shortlist to DFID for approval, and again, this can take around 3 weeks. Sometimes it can take longer, sometimes it can take shorter. And as soon as we get that final approved list, we notify the applicant straight away as to whether they've been successful or not. Once applicants have been notified, if they are successful, they will then be contacted by our fiduciary risk team, who will start the due diligence process, and this takes anywhere of upwards of 7 weeks. Once the reports have been received and they get signed off by DFID, only at that point can applicants go into grant setup, and you'll be assigned your own performance and risk manager, who will be with you throughout the lifetime of your grant, and they will start then working on with you on the grant setup, and that takes anywhere from 3 weeks onwards. Sometimes it can take longer. Sometimes grant holders decide that they need to or it's not feasible for the project to start for another few months. So you'll have those discussions with your performance and risk manager if you are successful. So I'm now going to move on to the budgeting and financial reporting and due diligence. I'd just like to say here, I'm not an expert in this area. So if you do have some specific questions on this, I may not be able to answer them, but our fiduciary risk team can answer them, and I'll provide the email address at the end. So again, all of this is in much greater detail on our website. We have 3 guidance documents available. So we've got the principles of reporting, we've got budget classification, and we've got exchange rates, and that's all on our website. Across all of our reporting, we follow cash-based accounting, so we don't actually accept accruals. So you need to think about this early, as it does affect the timing of when you need, when you essentially need and receive the money to carry out your project. Reporting on transactions should be at the project level rather than the grant holder level. Many of you, if you are successful, many of you will have implementing partners based in country, and where this is the case, we'd usually see a large lump sum transfer going from you as the grant holder to your implementing partner, but that doesn't really give us much information. So what we ask for is not just reporting on your own spending, but also on your implementing partner's spending, and that's part of the transparency that DFID need. We follow DFID's financial year, which is from the 1st of April to the 31st of March. In terms of flexibility in budgets for SCCF, there is some flexibility between years. You will obviously have a total project budget, but you will be able to flex money between the years in agreement with our fiduciary risk team and your performance and risk manager. Everyone will follow a quarterly financial reporting process. Broadly, you'll tell us what you spent in one quarter. We'll review the report you've sent in, and then we'll make payments for the following quarter. So as part of your application, everyone obviously has to submit a budget. And when doing this, it's really important that it's as accurate as possible and that it does reflect your activities. There will be room for amendments if you are successful, so you'll discuss with the fiduciary risk team as to whether the budget is accurate and realistic if you are successful. However, when you're putting your budget together for your application form, do ensure you aren't unrealistic, as reviewers will be looking at that, and they have obviously the experience to be able to assess budgets and assess whether they are realistic or not. Always follow your project plan and make sure your budget is built up from the activity level. Profile your costs realistically across the project. In doing so, research the actual costs of activities. Otherwise, you can leave yourself in quite a serious position where you promise to deliver one thing, but in actual fact, the costs are much more. So it is really important to fully profile and research your cost. It's also really important that you don't create your budget in isolation. So do make sure you involve colleagues, so particularly involve maybe your colleagues who are going to be delivering the project, and also make sure you involve your implementing partners if you do have implementing partners, as they'll have a clear idea of the budget and the costs as well. So in terms of what your budget should include, again, this is all online, and there is a list of what items are eligible and what items are ineligible. So please do look at that document. However, just to note some of the headline findings in terms of the things that are regularly included and forgotten about. You should always consider whether or not you need to include inflation. For example, if your project is going on for more than 1 year, then do think about, then you should be thinking about inflation. Make sure you prepare detailed granular budgets. It's not enough to just include 1 or 2 budget lines for all of the project activities that are taking place. Likewise, do include clear descriptors. It's really important that the reviewer reviewing your budget gets a clear picture of the project and can link it back to your work plan and back to the narrative. You should always include the true costs of the project delivery. There really is no need to subsidize your own staff costs and time, and you should be including a realistic amount for your overheads. But similarly, obviously, don't include too much, and by that I mean, we wouldn't expect to see that most of your budget is taken up by one staff member's salary. If in doubt, use the who, what, where, when, how approach for each budget line to make sure you are covering all of your activities. Again, some things not to include, as I've already mentioned, we don't fund large capital costs. Cars can't be included in your budget. DFID won't allow that. We also won't fund any non-cash items such as depreciation or accrual. And we also can't accept contingency costs. So again, you need to make sure that your budgets are really thought through and you've really researched the costs so that you're in the best position possible. When the project is up and running, if you are successful, as I mentioned, advance payments will be provided. And this means that essentially on signature of the contract, you'll be given the first 3 months of your budgeted spend, plus an additional 20% for projects which run up to 1 year, and an additional 10% for projects which run up to 2 years. And this is to give you working capital to allow the processing time between you submitting a financial report and us making payment for the next quarter. So it shouldn't mean that you are having to cover costs from your own organisation's pot of money. And as I said, this was brought in, this is just for SCCF grant holders, and this was brought in after DFID consulted with SCCF grant holders about this. So everything in the financial report is supposed to be evidence-based. As I mentioned, we follow quarterly reporting, so that's April to June, July to September, October to December, and January to March. And what you'll be reporting on is transaction line levels. So essentially you'll send us a spreadsheet showing all of the transactions that have taken place in the project for that quarter, for the previous quarter. And this is to allow us complete transparency and oversight of what has been sent, and also to facilitate the audit process which will occur. In terms of, hopefully that gives you some clarity on the financial reporting claims process. It may be more detailed for DFID than other donors, but it's important for them to have this level of transparency. And we've also found actually that it's been very helpful for grant holders who've gone through the process, as it does enable them to be it enables us to support them a bit better, and it also supports them in future if they do receive larger grants. So moving on to due diligence, this is an area that frequently causes concern, and it really shouldn't. The important thing is that it is it's a precursor to all DFID funding, so it really is an essential part of you receiving any DFID grant. Essentially, due diligence is our assessment of your organisation to make sure we know the money is going to go to the beneficiaries as intended. It looks at risk of fraud and also the capacity of your organisation to deliver the project. We follow a staged approach, so during the application stages, applicants probably won't be aware of this, but the fiduciary risk team will assess the accounts of applicants and look through the identity documentation and registration documents that you've provided. And this is to carry out an initial integrity due diligence. And that's all based on the documents that you have to provide alongside your application form. When an organisation is shortlisted, this is the stage we carry out a financial management assessment, and the financial management assessment follows a standardised four-pillar approach, which is DFID's standard policy, and this covers 4 sections. So it covers governance and internal control, ability to deliver, financial stability, and downstream activity. And there is also increased focus on safeguarding now, as I'm sure that won't be a surprise. And so there's also an assessment around safeguarding. Due diligence is always undertaken by an experienced member of the Manny and Daniels team or a consultant that we've worked with for a long time. We know there is a lot of concern about this, but there really isn't anything to worry about. Especially as we've worked with so many small organisations over the last few years, we really do have very realistic expectations of the positions that smaller organisations are in. And it's really intended that the process is beneficial for you, and it forms capacity building, and it's a two-way learning process. And some of the feedback that we've had from SCCF organisations has been that it has, you know, those that have been through the process and come out the other side have really said that it's almost been a free kind of consultancy process, and that they often, you know, to go through that you'd have to pay a lot of money, and we're there to support you all throughout the way. And when you apply for big amounts of funding in the future, your organisation will be in a much stronger position to do so. So in terms of how the due diligence process works itself, so an introductory email gets sent out with instructions, and this is about 24 hours after you receive notification that your grant has been successful. You'll get given the contact details of your fiduciary risk assessor as in that email, and they'll set up a time with you for an initial phone call. 2 weeks are then given to you to complete the necessary documentation that's needed for the due diligence, and this includes a self-assessment questionnaire and
Hi there. We seem to have just lost the sound, but bear with us and we'll make sure it gets back. Sorry about that, Laura. Over to you.
That's all right. Okay, great. Can you hear me?
We can.
Perfect. Great. So yes. So I'll go back a couple of points just in case you missed it. So you get 2 weeks to complete the necessary documentation, which includes a self-assessment questionnaire and supporting documentation. And after that, you'll have a call with your assessor. Your assessor will then draft a report based on the findings, and this will be sent to you for fact checking. And this gives you a chance to see the report in its entirety before it goes to DFID. At the end of the process, the final signed off report will form part of your contract. So any recommendations that are in the report will also be included as part of your contract. So for example, there could be, we refer to them as special conditions. There could be a special condition that you need to do X within 3 months of signing your contract. And the fiduciary risk team, so they passed on one word of warning, which is to not go out and start writing a whole load of policies on the back of, the due diligence process. The due diligence does include recommendations for which policies you need to write, and they'd much rather see an accurate view of where you're at currently, rather than where you think you might need to be at. So on this next slide, there are some useful resources, including the types of policies that you might be missing. I'm not going to go through them because, again, hopefully you can access them afterwards. So moving on, in terms of top tips and actual examples. So from SCCF 3, we got 100 applications in total, or 100 eligible applications, should I say. 21 were put forward for DFID moderation, so were recommended for funding. And 12 out of the 100 applications were from Scottish-based organisations. And we haven't made the announcement yet, so unfortunately I'm not able to tell you whether any of those 21 were Scottish-based organisations, but hopefully it won't be too long. Those organisations are going through due diligence as we speak. So, in terms of a successful applicant, so as I said, I'm pleased to say that this actual applicant is from the Small Charities Challenge Fund Round 2. They are a Scottish-based applicant, and their project was about community health resilience in rural Zambia. And what you see there is a summary version of the feedback that they received from the reviewer, but I'm just going to go through in a little bit more detail to kind of tease out the sorts of areas that they were strong. Well, they were primarily strong in because they were successful, but hopefully it'll give you an idea of kind of the level of detail and maybe the sorts of things that maybe you wouldn't have thought about. So this applicant, they provided a clear project summary outlining what they wanted to achieve, what districts they'd be working in, how they would achieve the change through, and they outlined that they had a three-pillar approach to this, and that included treatment, teaching, and training. And they clearly outlined exactly who they were targeting, and also crucially why they were targeting those beneficiaries. One thing to note is that the summary could have been more concise, but it was very clear. They were also very clear about why their project was needed, and they included evidence of this at national level. But then crucially, they also provided a district situational analysis and stats for the two proposed districts that they were going to be working in. They clearly showed how the project aligned with the Zambia National Health Strategic Plan of 2017 to 2021. They outlined how and why the beneficiaries they were targeting were particularly vulnerable and marginalised. So clearly there they were linking it to DFID's priorities of targeting the most vulnerable and marginalised. In terms of their engagement with key stakeholders, they clearly outlined who these were. For example, they gave examples of the district health officers, the rural health centre staff, the rural health centres that they would be working with, and also other NGOs. And they also particularly focused on the other NGOs and showed how they were aware of these NGOs that were working in these areas, but outlined how their project wouldn't be duplicating the work of those NGOs. And also they outlined their stakeholders who were the beneficiaries themselves, and they explained the consultation undertaken with all of these stakeholders and how the findings fed into their project design. The proposal was clear about how they intended to achieve the change, and the results framework provided adequate detail. The risk section was particularly strong, and as it clearly considered all the key risks, and also the mitigation strategies that they outlined were realistic. And this really gave confidence to the reviewer that risk would be dealt with sufficiently and effectively. So that was one of them. I've also got another one, which I think I don't have it on the slide, but I think it would be quite helpful for me to cover. So another one of our successful applicants, so their application was particularly strong. It's been one of our highest scoring applications from an SCCF round. They provided a very clear and concise project summary, which outlined exactly what they wanted to achieve, by when, who their target group was, and they also highlighted that a key aim was to build evidence and best practice within the area, within their kind of project area, so that they could share lessons learned among the sector. They outlined how they had consulted with stakeholders as part of the design of the project. So this included a 9-month participatory approach with their implementing partners. It included focus group discussions with participants of a pilot project to assess their experiences and the strengths and weaknesses of that project. And they clearly described how the outcome of these groups, they clearly described what the outcome of these groups were, and showed how it informed the project design. They described lessons they learned, they'd drawn on in the development of the approach. They set the scene very well for the reviewer by clearly describing the specific problem they were trying to address. It was clear that a key part of the project was collaboration and learning for the partners, and that they intended to disseminate the learnings within the country and the sector and use it to inform their own future scale up of the project. They plan to use a digital tool to support with monitoring, and were able to demonstrate how this would contribute to their M&E strategy, their monitoring and evaluation strategy, and how this would work in principle, how often the tool would be used, and also by whom, like who specifically would carry out the monitoring evaluation and what skills they had. And also, they also linked this into supporting with value for money and capacity building. They also explained precisely how they intended to analyse the learnings from the project, and explained what they intended to do with these learnings. In terms of the change they expected to achieve by the end of the project, this was broken down into what the specific change or outcome they were aiming for, how the change would be delivered through 6 outputs measured through SMART, gender and disability disaggregated key performance indicators, and how this would lead to long-term change for the beneficiaries. And they also went on to describe what data would be collected at what stages. I think I already mentioned that. So moving on, so they're the sorts of things that I'd recommend that you consider. The key points that I would say with these successful applicants is that, as I mentioned before, they weren't making assumptions of what the reviewer knew about their project, what they knew about the area. Of course, as I mentioned, the reviewers do have experience in the sector and in the country, but it doesn't mean that they know this particular district that you're proposing that you work in. So you need to clearly outline what research you've done, what you've learned from previous projects, to give confidence to the reviewer. So moving on, in terms of an unsuccessful application, so this application focused on access to IT education for poverty-stricken students in Uganda. So that was the name of the title of their project. So this again was a scale up of a previously successful project. However, they didn't outline the impact of the previous project very well. They did describe a need for IT equipment and education in terms of there being a lack of both in Uganda, but there weren't really any statistics or evidence to support the specific needs. So they just made a very general statement about that. They didn't back that up with any statistics or evidence. There was a lack of detail in terms of the intervention, and the reviewer was left with numerous unanswered questions about how the project would be delivered. The risk section was actually quite strong, with the most important ones outlined and including appropriate mitigation strategies. The budget crucially lacked a lot of detail, so there were no budget notes, making it impossible for the reviewer to identify whether or not the costs were realistic or accurate. The sustainability section was also lacking. And there was no mention of the Ministry of Education and there was no mention of how the Ministry of Education and district officials would be involved in the project, or really whether the aim was to try to integrate the project into the national education system going forward. So there really wasn't any focus on sustainability at all. I've got one other, which I don't have the slide for, unsuccessful application feedback. So this was about increasing access to clean water and reducing waterborne diseases in district in Tanzania. So the reviewer had concerns with the intended approach and felt that it wasn't really addressing the challenges for water access. The applicant focused on describing the need across Uganda rather than describing the local context. They didn't therefore outline why it was the most disadvantaged ward or whether the project was targeting the most vulnerable. They stated that the local government backed the idea based on certain conditions, but didn't really outline what those conditions were. So they were making, again, very generalised statements. There was little thought given to M&E, which was reflected in the budget. However, gender and disability were well considered and clearly outlined, and they clearly outlined the inclusive approach they'd take. So in the past, we have asked previous SCCF applicants for some top tips, and there's some there. So again, those who have been successful have read the UK Direct website carefully and understood the kind of projects that DFID is interested in. They recommend you make sure you understand value for money and efficiency, spend time and budget for getting your monitoring and evaluation right. Don't be over ambitious in what you'll achieve, as we said, or as I said. And do think about creating partnerships with other NGOs to make to more effectively deliver your project and provide better value for money. And then, as I mentioned, you'll get a performance and risk manager throughout your project, and we asked for some tips from one of our PRMs, and they said be very clear about your projects, show you understand the context of where you propose to be working, explain how you will build local capacity, and consider how you will collect evidence demonstrating what you hope to achieve. So I've just got some very final points to remember. So do include a worked example. So by that I mean include evidence of projects that you've delivered in the past, to give confidence to the reviewer that you have the necessary experience to deliver a project of a similar nature. Make sure that your results framework, work plan and budget operate together, so make sure there aren't discrepancies between these, as the reviewer will pick up on these. Understand your outputs and activities. Make sure your budget has enough detail, includes clear descriptions, and and also make sure you talk to your implementing partners if you have them and involve them in the process.
We do have Jen Ruddick on the line. Jennifer is the Programme and Policy Manager for the Civil Society team at DFID, which is the Department for International Development. And we also have online, and she's joined us from Kenya, someone who successfully applied for the SCCF in the previous round. So thank you. Over to Jen.
So we've got a really good question from Emma Birtles from Just Wheels. And Emma said, I am from a tiny organisation. Our income last year was 7.5k. Would DFID be confident of our ability to manage project funds in this situation? And what I would say is that I wouldn't let your small income be a barrier to applying. So we have funded organisations already who had a lower annual turnover than this. So you are definitely at the smaller end of the Small Charity Challenge Fund grantees so far. But I think that if you're confident in your ability to manage a £50,000 grant and you can kind of provide us with kind of good reasons why you're confident that you can do that, then I think that would be fine. So I guess things like evidence that you've managed the grants like this, or kind of a really good knowledge of the project that you're proposing or the communities that you'll be working with, or if it's scaling up something you've already done, would all be really helpful. So that kind of evidence would be really useful. Hopefully that answers the question. So the next question that I can answer is from Sonia Willett from Renew. He said, can due diligence be conducted prior to submitting an application? And the answer is no. So I guess what you're looking for is, I guess the premise of the question is that you don't want to put in all of this evidence kind of for your project and then find out that there's something at due diligence that means you can't be taken forward after putting in all that effort. I think what I would say, and Laura Spilsbury, come in if this is wrong, is that the due diligence is, I think we frame it in a very different way to due diligence that's undertaken by the rest of DFID. So we're looking for, if there's something that, if there's a policy that's not in place that you don't have and you haven't needed to have it yet because your organisation is really small or it hasn't worked in this context before, then that's fine, and that kind of thing isn't going to exclude you from being funded. So I guess I'd just like to say that the due diligence process is hopefully not as scary as you'd seem, and it's quite collaborative, I think. So in terms of once you're undergoing due diligence, we've already shortlisted you, and we'll do kind of everything that we can to work with you to support you to get through it, and then move to start implementing your project. Laura, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I would definitely echo that point, and I think what the feedback we have had from SCCF grant holders in particular is that if once they've gone through the due diligence, come out the other end, that it really has strengthened them as an organisation, it's strengthened their governance, and it's put them in a position to to go on and apply for larger funding rounds from other funders. And I think that obviously it can be a difficult process at times, but it is a positive process, I think, as well.
Thanks, Laura. So the next question that I have, I've done these in a really strange order. So I'm going to go to Gilbert Cameron's question next, from the Lake Victoria Disability Centre. So he said that his organisation is all volunteers with no paid staff, and asked if it's possible to send an outline of a proposal to get an idea if it would be worthwhile spending the hours to complete an application. At this stage, that's not possible, so it's a competitive process. Everybody needs to submit an application. What I would say is that I think what I'd like to say is thank you for asking the question, and it is really kind of useful to know that people are kind of in this position and feeling like maybe that would be difficult. We're currently in a 2-year pilot of SCCF, so kind of all the feedback that we get from you on things like this is really useful, and it'll be taken into account as we design the next phase. So the next question is one, Laura Spilsbury. I might come to you on this one.
Yep.
But if you don't know, I guess we can check in with your team. The Turing Trust have asked whether the results framework needs to all fit on a single page.
Yeah, I don't think it does, because essentially it's in a Word document, and as I mentioned, if you are a 2-year, if your project is 2 years, we want you to cover both of those 2 years, and we want your results framework to be as detailed as possible. So no, it doesn't need to fit on a single page, but it should be in the same Word document.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm also going to come to you on this next one. So the Turing Trust again has asked a question about incorporating references in the application, and saying, can this go into an attachment to not take up space from the character limit?
I guess, but yeah, by references, I guess a question reference from a previous. Do you mean reference from a previous organisation that they've worked with, or a reference to, say, a study that they are they're referencing in their application? If it's a reference to, say, a study that they're referencing, as I mentioned, you don't need to include the whole reference. You could just include the year and the source. But having said that, if you wanted to list out all your references, then you can effectively submit as many documents as possible. But what I would suggest is that there does need to be a source and a year in the narrative of your proposal. Like when you make a statement on stats, or if you're referencing a survey, do include something in there so it's clear to the reviewer that it's come from.
Great, and I think that on this document, James had just said that they were looking for references, as in kind of where statistics have come from and things. So that's great. So where can I find detailed guidance on the budget spreadsheet? I think Laura might have covered this in her presentation, but we can send the link to the Alliance to circulate to you.
Yeah.
Great. And I think Laura's also covered timescales, so we've had a question about that as well. There's one here that also says, how quickly is work supposed to commence following a successful award? Again, Laura, kind of moderate what I say if this isn't the case, but we want to be as flexible as possible, so we're not going to force you to start by a certain date if that doesn't work for your project. So if you've got all of your kind of due diligence recommendations actioned and you're ready to sign the grant, but it doesn't make sense for you to start work because it's the rainy season, for example, then we're not going to make you do that. So I think, I don't want to say that you can wait as kind of an unreasonable amount of time, but I think kind of if there are valid reasons for not starting straight away, then that's fine too. And I don't think we'd put kind of a specific time limit on that for that reason.
No, I think, yeah, exactly, Jem.
Great. We've got a question about feedback on community partnership grant applications, and when will unsuccessful applications get feedback? And I think the answer to that is really soon.
Yeah. I appreciate that the UK Direct 4 is opening on the 4th of March, so we're really aiming to get that feedback out to those applicants, those unsuccessful applicants, before it opens.
Thanks, Laura. And I guess what I would say for SCCF is, and Laura might have already said this when I wasn't on the call, so sorry if it's repetition, is that we have had quite a few applicants successful on kind of a second or third time applying, having implemented things that the fund manager recommended in the feedback that they sent to them. So if you have applied unsuccessfully for one of our funds, please do take that feedback seriously and consider applying again if you think you can action it. I've got a follow-up questions from Emma and Sonia. So Sonia is asking if there are aspects of due diligence that you don't mean, it doesn't automatically mean your application fails. Yes, that's right, Sonia. I think that's right to an extent. So if we found that you were doing something illegal, or there was something really serious that we hadn't been notified about, then there are things like that, so like fraud and things, where we would say, no, we can't take this forward, the risk to these funds is too high. But I think if it's just things like you're all volunteer run, you haven't got any policies in place because you've not needed to have that, certain banking things, where it's things that we can work with you to help you get it in place, then you wouldn't fail on that. And I guess what's really key as well is, and I think Laura can back me up on this, hopefully, is that what we found is that kind of how you do due diligence in terms of the number of policies you've got in place is kind of no indicator of how kind of quickly you'll be able to get through that process and get your project started. So a really important thing for us has been how willing an organisation is to work with us to get these things in place. So if you feel like due diligence is going to flag up a lot of things that you don't have in place, I would say if you are kind of ready for that and have worked out how you're going to be able to implement the recommendations and communicate that clearly to us during the process, that will definitely be taken into account.
Yeah, and I just echo that point again, and I just say that in terms of when I talked about the financial management assessment report, you'll essentially you'll get a grade of I think it's minor, moderate, major, severe. If you get a major, you know, there'll be certain recommendations that are outlined in that report that will say you don't have X policy in place, and potentially that would form a special condition, we call it, as part of signing your accountable grant arrangement, and that would form your contract, and then you would agree to the time frame that is in your contract to meet that special condition. So absolutely, if there are areas that you don't meet, it definitely doesn't mean that your application will fail and you won't pass through due diligence.
Thanks, Laura. Sonia, hopefully that has answered your question. I think the only other question on this document that we've not covered is an additional comment from Emma, who has said, do you ever link up organisations who might be working on similar topics or similar areas? This might be useful. I think for our grantees, we do that. So if we were aware, for example, of kind of an organisation that had a community partnership grant in a similar area to an SCCF grantee that's about to start work, I think we'd probably put them in touch. Laura?
Yeah, and I didn't mention, but once applicants are notified that they have been successful, one of the first things we do, you'll be contacted by the fiduciary risk team and that process will kick into place. But one of the first things we do on SCCF grants is to hold a workshop in London where we invite all the successful applicants to come along, and that gives you an opportunity to meet the other successful applicants, and you can obviously there are opportunities to network in that workshop, and then another thing that we do is we hold quarterly reference group meetings for all our active grant holders. So that is and we invite grant holders to come and feed back to us on certain topics. So we'll have a room full of UKA direct large impact grant holders, we'll have SCCF grant holders, and again that's an opportunity to network. So as well as, like Jen said, there are opportunities that we can actively link you up with projects. There are also other opportunities for you to network with other UKA direct grant holders.
Thanks, Laura. I think we've got time for one more question, and there has just been one added to the list. Sort of hoping that nobody would ask this because there's a limit to what I can say. Chris Pettigrew from the International Voluntary Service has said, any word on possible replacement fund to the Small Charities Challenge Fund, or if the fund will be continued? I think what I would say on this is watch out for an announcement in the coming weeks. As soon as we can confirm, we will let the Alliance know, who will be able to let you know. I guess what I would say, and you can read between the lines on this, is that funding small British charities remains kind of a passion and a priority for our ministers. So I would be fairly confident that the answer to your question will be positive.
I guess just to add on to that point, that I would still really stress, as I mentioned earlier, to go ahead and apply in this current funding round if you are interested in SCCF grants. So obviously there's no kind of confirmation on that, and we aren't really sure, well, we wouldn't be sure necessarily, Jen, of the time frame of when that would open, would we? So do go ahead and apply in this current funding round, which closes on the 28th of March.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I'd say we're very tentatively positive about the future of SCCF and DFID's commitment to funding small charities. But if you can apply in this round, do. The worst that will happen if you apply in this round and you're not quite ready is you'll probably get some quite helpful feedback to be able to apply in a future round.